Mr. Steve Maxime, who will be presenting on the perspectives on the impact of climate change on agri-food sector workers in the Caribbean. Steve Maxime is an internationally recognized expert on climate change, comprehensive climate-smart agriculture, climate justice, and leveraging intellectual property. Having worked in every CARICOM country, he has championed the triple carriageway of creativity, science, and intellectual property as a path to regional development. Steve has been a contributor to the CWF since its inception. So join me again in welcoming Mr. Steve Maxime.
Thank you very much and good morning. I am at a loss. How do I follow Professor Hussain? The only thing we have in common so far is that we both know that Messi played for Argentina. I'm not sure if in terms of intellectual matching up, we will be in any way comparable, but I'll do my thing. So I want to welcome everyone and to say that I've been asked to talk about the impact of climate change on the agri-food working sectors. Are we still going to have difficulty? There you go. I'm technologically more adroit than I thought. Yes, so when I talk about the agri-food sector, I'm really talking about those workers in what I refer to as the loop value chain. We have been promoting this idea of a loop value chain for many years. It's now become fashionable when people talk about the circular economy. But we in this sector have been talking about the recycling of nutrients and knowing that agriculture involves not just from farm to fork, but from farm to farm. And these workers run the gamut from all the workers within the CVQ categories 1 to 5. And those are the people responsible for the entirety of the natural or the non-built environment. And those are the people producing, processing, serving, and disposing of food, which is an aspect of it that we tend not to concentrate on. Now, climate change and the climate crisis impacts these workers in many ways, direct and indirectly. The direct impacts are due to the hydrometeorological nature of climate change, like flooding, drought, extreme events, high temperatures, whereas the indirect impacts are due to the exacerbation of existing conditions, inequalities, and injustices. And that's a word that you see me using a lot. Some of the health issues include the negative impacts on their physical well-being through injury, death, disease, malnutrition. And in this case, when I refer to health, I'm talking about health as defined by the WHO, which is not just the absence of disease or injury, but in terms of your ability to function normally. The impact on your mental health. And this has to do with depression, anxiety disorders, addictive behaviors, eating disorders, PTSD. And you may want to know, well, why is this agriculture man talking about all these types of things? Because several categories of agri-food workers operate outdoors. So they're at the literal mercy of heat waves, dehydration risk, airborne pollutants, pathogens, flash flooding, failed infrastructure. And that's an aspect that we tend to ignore. You talk about failed infrastructure, you talk about the destruction of bridges and roadways, and so that can literally cut you off from the type of services that most other people will be able to enjoy. And these outdoor workers are the foresters, the park and green space managers, the landscapers, the field workers, the waiters, food handlers, and vendors. Now, several categories of agri-food workers operate outdoors, and as I said, they're additionally exposed to the indirect impacts due to inequalities with respect to health insurance and paid leave. And this is where I'm starting to don my farmer organizer and union hat, in that I was on the board of WINFA, which was the largest trade union or representation of workers in the Windward Islands for more than a decade. And we understood then what are the shortcomings or the shortfalls that you establish if you do not have a well-organized farming base. Some of these direct impacts affect all workers, even those not consigned to operate outdoors. So you may think that, okay, so there are color and tie workers in the agricultural sector too. But sick building syndrome is not uncommon within the sector. And this is arising from poor air quality, contagion spread, inadequate personal protection equipment, and unsanitary facilities. Now, many categories of agri-food workers are afforded low societal status, and this is where we're starting to get into the meat of the matter here. With the attendant inequalities with respect to job security and employment benefits. And any of you who have represented agricultural workers or people in the agricultural sector would know that this is a fact. Climate change disproportionately impacts such workers by exacerbating anxiety disorders, given the fragility of job tenure. And job tenure is a euphemism. There's very, very little tenure in terms of some of these workers. And the catastrophic job-ending potential of floods, droughts, and extreme events. Let me just repeat that. And the catastrophic job-ending potential of floods, droughts, and extreme events. Now, this worker dependence on nature-driven phenomena is essential to the disproportionate negative impacts of climate change due to interruption, disruption, and reorientation caused by some of these key phenomena. Now, the majority of level 1, 2, and 3 Caribbean agri-food workers are in a union environment like this. I don't think I need to go through what the levels that they see, the Caribbean vocational qualification levels, but maybe I do, because I'm seeing some more knowledgeable people than me not in their head. So a level 1 worker would be at the level of the unskilled worker. 2 would be supervisory, 3 would be 2 would be the journeyman type, 3 would be a supervisory, 4 would be, your technical, and 5 would be your executive management levels in terms of Caribbean vocational qualification. Now, the majority of level 1, 2, and 3 Caribbean agri-food workers are vulnerable to climate-related risk, as I mentioned previously. But apart from all of that, the production levels internationally directly impact the livelihoods of Caribbean agri-food workers, because sections of the food value chains can be at risk due to reduced yields internationally. Weather delayed transportation. I mean, I lived in Tortola at one time and it was remarkable. At the hint of a hurricane, you go to the grocery shelves and they're bare, because they recognize that any type of event like that, nothing is coming out of Miami, nothing is on the shelf. Price increases, and then there's localized hoarding, which has, again, those types of impacts. Now, pre-existing inequalities place the livelihoods of these workers at risk, due in part to the inadequate provisions for insurance, for employee care, some of the lamentable issues. Extreme weather events and rising sea levels have the potential to continue destroying homes, crops, infrastructure, and ruins people's ability to earn a living, thereby affecting their right to shelter, food, freedom of movement, residence, and work, respectively. Now, we heard about the Venezuelan immigrants, both legal and undocumented. And although we may say that there are political reasons there are implications that there are some aspects of climate migration as well. And even within our own country, we have had issues of potential climate migration, climate-induced migration. Now, agri-food workers are not exclusively affected, but are often disproportionately so, given their societal status and oftentimes weak or non-existent trade union representation. I'm saying this without fear of too much contradiction, even in a room filled with trade unionists. Now, only during episodes of crisis-related shortages does officialdom deem these workers essential. And this is something that always amuses me, And hastily contrived policy, legislative, or regulatory mechanisms to increase their visibility and bolster support for their livelihoods. I mean, COVID was a perfect example of that. All of a sudden, these lowly workers were now considered essential workers. And all sorts of legislative maneuvering came about, including providing them with passes to break the curfew, etc., etc. Because we miraculously, we realized that these are the people who are feeding us. Now, the agri-food workers are often victims of policy blindness, except during crises, as I mentioned just now. And that climate injustice is linked to forced transitions. And this is where we get into the whole business of just transitions now. And this is where we find that agri-food workers are particularly disadvantaged. Now, the agri-food workers, by dint of their essential role, have relatively low social status and have inadequate union representation, are often directed to adaptation and mitigation programs for which they have not been suitably prepared. And this is a point that requires repetition. You've heard about all of these mitigation and adaptation policies and plans, etc., but they are literally being forced down the throats of the agri-food workers, because if you're not part of the understanding of where these transitions are coming from, that is at the core of what an unjust transition is. Now, climate change impacts on agri-food workers span the issues of health, livelihoods, fundamental human rights, and just transitions. Of the four main categories of impacts I mentioned, the decidedly unjust one is the one that has to do with the transitions. And this poses a great and less publicly discussed risk to them. While threats to their health, livelihoods, and fundamental rights have been articulated elsewhere, the undermining of their contributions through lack of recognition for their intellectual property, traditional knowledge. Oh, sorry. I'm ahead of myself. Not for the first time, I can assure you. Yeah. So we're now back on. You're going to blame your computer and you're going to blame the tech guys for not seeing the slides change, those of you on Zoom, but it's really my fault. So the undermining of their contribution through lack of recognition of their intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and resilience has been less explored. So the impending expansion of AI in terms of the associated devices for algorithmic and autonomous operation presents another layer of impact. But just as a side note, we in the sector have had to deal with AI before in terms of artificial insemination. And just as we thought it was so unnatural and it was going to cause gloom and doom, we are going to embrace AI and we're going to use it to our advantage. So I fear not. This has been a teaser. It's a wider, of course, it is a wider and deeper dialogue. I am not a big firm believer in the fact that you must be never ending to be memorable. And having to follow Professor Hossain, I took in front, not just in front of the goalpost, I took in front to make sure that I didn't go on beyond my welcome. But I'm available, of course, for this question and answer session. Thank you very much.